The air at Murtala Muhammad International Airport buzzed with activity. Amid the crowd of travelers, a private jet bearing the insignia of Hawk Petroleum landed gracefully on the tarmac. Its silver sheen caught the attention of curious onlookers, airport officials and journalists who had gotten wind of a high-profile arrival. The door of the jet opened, and a man stepped out. Standing tall at 6 feet, dressed in a tailored navy suit that seemed to shimmer under the Lagos sun, Alexander Pierce exuded confidence. His sharp features, blue eyes that seemed to pierce into one's soul, and a jawline sculpted like granite, matched his reputation as a young millionaire with an unmatched track record in the oil and gas industry. At just 32, Alexander had built Hawk Petroleum into a global powerhouse. But today it wasn't New York or Dubai that interested him. It was Nigeria, the land of untapped potential. A convoy of black SUVs with tinted windows waited on the runway, and a small delegation of government officials, local business tycoons, and oil executives hurried forward. "Mr. Pierce, welcome to Nigeria," boomed the voice of Chief Benson, a rotund man in his 50s wearing a cream agbada embroidered with gold. His hand extended, adorned with a massive ring. Alexander gripped it firmly, his piercing gaze meeting Benson's. "Thank you, Chief. I've heard great things about your country's potential. I'm here to make history." The bold statement sent murmurs through the delegation. Chief Benson chuckled, though uneasily. "Nigeria's resources are vast, Mr. Pierce, but so are her challenges. It's not all boardrooms and contracts here." Alexander smiled faintly. "Chief Benson, I thrive where others falter. Challenges don't deter me. They excite me." Benson raised an eyebrow, impressed by the young man's composure. They began walking toward the convoy, followed by the entourage. The humid Lagos air didn't seem to bother Alexander, though his assistant, Claire, a no-nonsense woman in her late 20s, dabbed her forehead discreetly with a handkerchief. "Claire," Alexander said as they entered the lead SUV, "have you arranged the meeting with the Minister of Petroleum?" "Yes, sir," Claire replied, flipping through her tablet. "You'll meet him at the Hilton this evening. He's eager to discuss the offshore drilling opportunities you proposed." Alexander nodded, his expression unreadable. As the convoy moved, he gazed out of the tinted window, watching the vibrant streets of Lagos come alive with their own kind of energy. Vendors lined the roads, hawking everything from roasted corn to car parts. Yellow danfos weaved recklessly through traffic, their conductors shouting destinations. It was chaos, yet there was opportunity in the madness. "First impressions?" asked Claire, breaking his silence. "Lagos is raw," Alexander said, still staring out the window. "But raw materials are where the real wealth lies. The trick is knowing how to refine them." As they approached Echo Atlantic, a gleaming new city rising from reclaimed land along Lagos coast, Alexander's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and frowned. "It's Carter," he said, referring to the CEO of Apex Energy, Hawk Petroleum's fiercest rival. "Don't pick up," Claire advised. "You know he's just fishing for information." Alexander smirked and answered anyway. "Carter," he said smoothly. "What an unexpected surprise." "Pierce," came the gravelly voice on the other end. "I hear you've landed in Lagos. Bold move, considering the market here isn't exactly stable." "I prefer the term ripe for disruption," Alexander replied, "but I appreciate your concern. Should I assume Apex is staying out of Nigeria then?" Carter chuckled darkly. "Let's just say we're watching closely. Good luck, Pierce. You'll need it." The line went dead, but Alexander's smirk remained. "He's worried," he said to Claire. "They all are," Claire replied. "You've made too many waves, Alex. This is uncharted territory." "That's why it's perfect," he said. The convoy pulled into the sprawling compound of the Echo Hotel, where the Minister of Petroleum was waiting in a private lounge. The meeting was a critical first step, and Alexander knew the stakes. Nigeria's oil reserves were among the largest in the world, but its infrastructure was plagued with inefficiencies, corruption, and political instability. As they entered the lounge, the minister rose to greet them. "Mr. Pierce," he said warmly, "it's a pleasure to finally meet the man behind the legend." "Minister Adamu," Alexander replied, shaking his hand firmly. "The pleasure is mine. I've heard you're a man who gets things done." Adamu chuckled, gesturing for them to sit. "I try my best, but as you'll soon discover, Nigeria is a complex puzzle. What makes you so confident Hawk Petroleum can succeed where others have failed?" Alexander leaned forward, his tone firm but inviting. "Because I don't see failure as an option. My team has studied your country's resource sources and challenges for months. We're not here to extract and leave. We're here to build partnerships, create jobs, and deliver results that will benefit both Hawk Petroleum and Nigeria. Adamu nodded, clearly intrigued. Your proposal is ambitious, but you'll need more than words to win over the stakeholders here. I came prepared, Alexander said, sliding a thick dossier across the table. This outlines our plans, from infrastructure development to community engagement. I believe you'll find it compelling. As the minister flipped through the pages, Alexander watched him carefully. He had learned early in his career that power wasn't just about wealth or influence. It was about reading people, understanding their motivations, and positioning oneself as the solution to their problems. After a moment, Adamu closed the dossier and smiled. Mr. Pierce, I think you and I are going to get along just fine. Alexander extended his hand, sealing the deal with a firm shake. Let's make history, Minister. The meeting with Minister Adamu concluded successfully, the atmosphere electric with optimism. The minister had been impressed not only by Alexander's proposal, but by his bold and confident demeanor. Handshakes were exchanged and promises were made over glasses of champagne. As Alexander stepped out of the private lounge, Claire approached him with a satisfied smile. Congratulations, Alex, she said, handing him his coat. That couldn't have gone better if we'd scripted it. Thank you, Claire, but this is just the beginning, Alexander replied. The real work starts now. Make sure the local team is ready to begin site assessments tomorrow. Yes, sir, Claire nodded. The convoy drove him back to his residence in Eco-Atlantic. Alexander had rented a palatial waterfront villa during his stay in Lagos. It was a sprawling, ultramodern structure with a sleek glass exterior that reflected the shimmering Atlantic Ocean. First, the driveway was lined with palm trees, and the house itself was surrounded by lush manicured lawns. Inside the house was a haven of luxury. The living room boasted high ceilings, minimalist white furniture, and a massive floor-to-ceiling window that offered an uninterrupted view of the ocean. A private infinity pool stretched across the patio, its blue waters blending seamlessly with the sea. Alexander walked into his bedroom, a master suite that looked more like a five-star hotel room. The king-size bed, draped in white Egyptian cotton sheets, sat against a wall-mounted panel of LED lighting that adjusted to his preference. A digital panel controlled everything, from the blinds to the room temperature. He shrugged off his jacket, placed it neatly on a hanger, and sat on the edge of the bed. For the first time that day, he allowed himself to relax. Claire entered the room briefly. "Do you need anything before I leave, Alex?" she asked. "No, I'm good. Get some rest, Claire. Tomorrow's going to be another long day." She smiled and left, closing the door softly behind her. Alexander stretched out on the bed, letting the sound of the ocean waves lull him into a deep, dreamless sleep. Miles away from the glittering Eco-Atlantic, life in a small, crowded Lagos neighborhood began with the sound of generators humming, kettles whistling, and vendors shouting. In a one-room apartment with peeling paint and a tiny bed pressed against the wall, BC sat cross-legged on the floor, folding her son's clothes. BC was a strikingly beautiful woman, with smooth dark skin, round cheeks, and large, expressive eyes. She had a warmth about her that shone through despite the weight of her struggles. Her 5-year-old son, Toby, was sitting nearby, playing with a plastic truck missing one wheel. "Mummy, when will you buy me a new truck?" Toby asked, looking up at her with innocent eyes. BC paused, her hands clutching a small shirt. "Soon, Toby," she said, forcing a smile. "I just need to find a new job first." Toby nodded, satisfied for now, and went back to playing. BC sighed as she folded the last of the clothes and placed them in a small wooden cupboard. Her last job at the salon had ended abruptly after the owner claimed she wasn't bringing in enough customers. It wasn't her fault. The economy was tough, and people were cutting back on luxuries. Standing up, she glanced at the cracked mirror hanging on the wall and adjusted her headscarf. Her reflection showed determination mixed with weariness. "Today is another day," she whispered to herself. Outside, the streets were bustling as always. BC made her way down the narrow road, holding Toba's hand. Vendors called out to passers-by, selling bread, oranges, and sachets of water. She stopped briefly to buy Toby a piece of roasted plantain from a woman grilling by the roadside. "How much?" BC asked. 500 naira, the woman replied. 500? BC raised her eyebrows. It was 300 just last week. The woman shrugged. Everything Don cost now, my sister. No be my fault. Reluctantly, BC handed over the money and gave the plantain to Toby, who happily bit into it. Her first stop was a clothing store she had heard was hiring. The manager, a tall woman with an air of authority, eyed her skeptically. Do you have any retail experience? The manager asked. Yes, Ma. I've worked in a salon and as a sales assistant at a boutique before, BC replied, her tone polite but confident. The manager pursed her lips. We'll call you if we need you. BC nodded, though she knew the tone all too well. It was a polite way of saying, don't bother waiting for a call. Her next stop was a restaurant that had advertised for kitchen staff. The owner, a balding man in his 60s, barely glanced at her. We're full, he said curtly. But I saw the help wanted sign outside, BC protested. That was yesterday. Someone's already taken the position, he replied, waving her off. By midday, BC was exhausted and discouraged. She sat on a bench by the roadside, wiping sweat from her forehead as Toby dozed off in her lap. A young man selling recharge cards approached her. Auntie, you go buy card? He asked. Not today, she said, shaking her head. He lingered for a moment, noticing the tired look on her face. You dey find work? Yes, she replied. Do you know anywhere that's hiring? He thought for a moment. I hear say one oil company dey hire cleaners. Their office no far from here. You fit, try your luck. BC's eyes lit up. Thank you. Where exactly? He gave her directions, and she hurried off, hope rekindled in her heart. By the time she reached the office building, her legs were aching, and the midday sun was merciless. She walked into the lobby, a cool, air-conditioned space that felt like another world compared to the sweltering streets outside. The receptionist, a young woman with a friendly smile, looked up. Good afternoon. How can I help you? Good afternoon. I heard you're hiring cleaners, BC said, trying to sound composed despite her nerves. Please fill out this form, the receptionist said, handing her a clipboard. As BC sat down to fill the form, she prayed silently. This job might not be glamorous, but it could be the lifeline she desperately needed. Her journey was far from over, but she had taken a step forward, and in Lagos, where survival was a daily battle, sometimes that was enough. The news of BC's employment brought a wave of relief that she hadn't felt in months. The oil company had hired her as part of their cleaning staff, a modest role, but one that offered stability. Her salary wasn't extravagant, but it was steady and enough to cover her rent, Toby's needs, and food. The first day of work was daunting. Dressed in her neat uniform and carrying a sense of determination, she arrived at the office at 7 a.m. sharp. She had woken up before dawn, made Toby breakfast, and dropped him off at the nearby daycare. The daycare wasn't luxurious, but the caregivers were kind, and Toby seemed to like it there. Bye, Mummy, Toby said cheerfully, waving his little hand. Be a good boy, Toby, she replied, kissing his forehead. The oil company's office was a sprawling glass building, pristine and professional. BC's supervisor, a stern-looking woman named Mrs. Olowu, greeted her at the entrance. Are you the new cleaner? Mrs. Olowu asked, her eyes scanning BC from head to toe. Yes, Ma, BC said, keeping her voice steady. Follow me, Mrs. Olowu instructed, leading her through the office. The tour was brisk and thorough. BC was introduced to the cleaning supplies closet, shown the floors she'd be responsible for, and briefed on the company's high standards. We expect everything to be spotless, Mrs. Olowu said, pointing to the polished marble floor. This is an oil company. Our clients are top executives and government officials. First impressions matter. Yes, Ma, BC nodded. By mid-morning, BC was on her hands and knees scrubbing a particularly stubborn coffee stain in the conference room. She wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, her arms aching, but she didn't complain. This job was her lifeline, and she intended to keep it. At lunch, she met some of her colleagues, a friendly bunch who welcomed her into their fold. BC, right? Asked Amaka, a slim woman with a loud laugh. Yes, BC replied, grateful for the warmth in Amaka's tone. You're lucky to get this job, Amaka said. These days, even cleaning jobs are hard to find. I know, BC said. I'm just grateful to be here. As they ate their simple meals, the conversation turned to their families. I have 2 kids, Amaka said. They're staying with my mother in the village. Lagos is too expensive to raise children. BC nodded. I have 1 boy, Toby. He's 5. Ah, small but mighty, Amaka said, laughing. They all chuckled, and for the first time in a while, BC felt a sense of belonging. Despite the exhaustion, BC found herself smiling at the end of the day. She picked up Toby from daycare, and his excitement at seeing her melted away her fatigue. "Mummy, Mummy, we drew pictures today," Toby exclaimed, waving a sheet of paper. "That's wonderful, Toby. Show me when we get home," she said, holding his hand tightly. Their tiny apartment felt a little less suffocating that evening. BC prepared a simple meal of yam and egg sauce, and they ate together while Toby talked about his day. "Mummy, are you happy?" he asked suddenly, his big eyes full of concern. BC paused, her heart swelling. "Yes, Toby. I'm happy because of you." Meanwhile, on the other side of Lagos, Alexander was thriving in his professional life. His oil and gas ventures were rapidly gaining momentum, and he had secured more partnerships and contracts than he had anticipated. However, his personal life was a different story. Alexander's luxurious villa, once a symbol of success, had become a source of stress. The house was immaculate when he moved in, but his busy schedule left him with little time for upkeep. Dishes piled up in the sink, laundry was scattered around his bedroom, and the once pristine floors were now speckled with dust. Claire, ever efficient, tried to intervene one morning. "Alex, you need to hire someone," she said firmly as she watched him rummage through a pile of clothes for a clean shirt. "I don't need a maid, Claire," he replied, his tone clipped. "Look at this place." Claire gestured around the room. "You can't even find your socks, and you're telling me you don't need help?" Alexander sighed, running a hand through his hair. I'm not used to having someone in my space. It feels intrusive." "Well, you need to get used to it," Claire said. "You're running a multi-million-dollar business. The last thing you need is to come home to chaos." He grumbled but didn't argue further. That evening, as he sat in his study, staring at the cluttered desk, Alexander finally admitted to himself that Claire was right. His professional success was being overshadowed by the disarray of his personal life. The next morning, he called Claire into his office. "Find someone," he said simply. "Someone for what?" Claire asked, though the smirk on her face showed she already knew the answer. "A maid, or a housekeeper." "Whatever you want to call it," Alexander said, leaning back in his chair. Claire grinned. "About time. I'll start the search immediately." As she left the room, Alexander leaned back and closed his eyes. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he was regaining control. Little did he know that the decision to hire a maid would bring a twist to his carefully planned life. The morning began with a heavy, humid air hanging over Lagos, the type that promised rain but delivered only discomfort. BC noticed Toby seemed unusually quiet as he sat at their small table, pushing his bowl of pap and akara around without much interest. "Toby, eat your food," she said, wiping her hands on her wrapper. "I'm not hungry, Mummy," he mumbled, his head resting on his hand. She walked over and placed her palm on his forehead. He felt warmer than usual, but she dismissed it as the effects of the hot, oppressive weather. "Are you okay, my dear?" she asked gently. Toby nodded slowly. "Yes, Mummy. Maybe it's just the sun," BC sighed. "Okay, but if you still feel this way after daycare, I'll take you to the clinic. Be strong for Mummy, eh?" He nodded again, giving her a small smile. Despite her worry, she couldn't afford to miss work, especially so soon after starting. The bills were piling up, and her salary was their only lifeline. At the daycare, Toby clung to her leg, a rare sign of reluctance from the normally cheerful boy. "Mummy, I don't want to stay today," he whispered. BC crouched down and hugged him. "I know you don't feel well, Toby, but Mummy has to go to work. The aunties here will take good care of you, okay?" Toby hesitated, then nodded. One of the daycare workers, a cheerful woman named Aisha, walked over. "Good morning, BC. Is everything all right?" "He's feeling a little warm," BC explained. "Please keep an eye on him for me. Nisfry, if it gets worse, call me immediately." Aisha nodded. "Don't worry. We'll take good care of him." BC kissed Toby on the forehead and hurried out, her heart heavy with guilt and worry. At the oil company, Alexander was preparing for an important meeting with a high-profile international client. The meeting room was a focal point of the day's events, and everything needed to be perfect. Claire, as always, was by his side, running through the final checklist. "All right, Alex," she said, handing him a printed agenda. "This meeting could solidify our next big deal. Let's make it count." "I always do," Alexander replied confidently, adjusting his tie. As they approached the meeting room, Alexander glanced at his watch. He was already running a few minutes late. Inside the room, BC was finishing up her morning cleaning duties. She had been particularly meticulous today, scrubbing every surface until it gleamed. Her mop bucket sat by the door, filled with soapy water she intended to dispose of after a final sweep. "Almost done," she muttered to herself, wiping a bead of sweat from her forehead. Just as she turned to wheel the mop bucket out, the door swung open abruptly. "Excuse me," Alexander said as he strode in, his attention fixed on the folder in his hand. Startled, BC instinctively pulled the bucket towards her, but the motion caused the mop handle to tip. In an instant, the bucket wobbled, and a wave of soapy water splashed onto Alexander's pristine suit. "Oh my God!" BC exclaimed, her hands flying to her face. Alexander froze, his expression a mix of shock and disbelief as he stared down at the water dripping from his tailored trousers. "What the?" he began, but Claire, who had followed closely behind, burst into laughter despite the situation. "Alex, you look like you just got caught in the rain," she said, barely able to contain her amusement. "I don't find this funny, Claire," Alexander snapped, grabbing a handkerchief from his pocket to dab at the mess. He turned to BC, his brows furrowed. "What were you thinking?" "I'm so sorry, sir," BC stammered, her voice trembling. "I didn't see you coming." "You didn't see me coming? This is a meeting room, not a swimming pool." Claire intervened, placing a hand on Alexander's arm. "Calm down, Alex. It was an accident." Alexander took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing at BC. "What's your name?" "BC, sir," she replied, barely audible. "Well, BC," he said, his tone sharp. "Next time, make sure the bucket is out of the way before someone walks in." "Yes, sir. I'm very sorry, sir," she said, bowing her head. Claire, still amused, handed Alexander a spare jacket she had been carrying. "Here. Change into this and let's move on. The client is waiting." Alexander shot one last glare at BC before leaving the room. As the door closed behind him, BC let out a shaky breath, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. "BC, what's going on here?" came the voice of Mrs. Olowu, who had just arrived. BC quickly explained, her voice trembling. Mrs. Olowu sighed, shaking her head. "Be more careful next time. You're lucky Mr. Alexander didn't fire you on the spot." "Yes, Ma," BC said, keeping her gaze fixed on the floor. As she mopped up the spilled water, she whispered to herself, "What a way to start the day." Little did she know, this encounter would set the stage for a connection she could never have anticipated. The day seemed to stretch endlessly for BC as she worked, trying to push away the nagging worry about Tobi's health. She had checked her phone during her break, but there were no missed calls from the daycare. Maybe he's feeling better now, she thought, allowing herself a small measure of relief. By 2 p.m., however, her worst fears were confirmed. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, and when she saw the daycare's number, her stomach sank. "Hello?" she answered quickly, stepping aside from her cleaning duties. "BC, this is Aisha from the daycare," came the calm but firm voice. "You need to come and pick up Toby immediately. He's running a fever, and he's very weak. I don't think it's something we can handle here." "Oh no," BC gasped, gripping her phone tightly. "I'm on my way. Please watch him for me." She hurried to find her supervisor, Mrs. Olowu, who was inspecting another part of the floor. "Ma, please, I need to take an emergency leave. My son is very sick, and I have to get him from daycare," she said, her voice trembling. Mrs. Olowu frowned, but nodded. "Fine, but don't make this a habit, BC. Go quickly." "Thank you, Ma," BC said, bowing slightly before dashing toward the exit. As she pushed through the glass doors, her focus was solely on reaching Toby. In her rush, she didn't notice Alexander striding into the building, engrossed in a phone conversation. The collision was sudden and jarring. BC stumbled backward, almost dropping her bag, while Alexander's phone slipped from his hand and hit the floor with a clatter. "Oh, no. I'm so sorry, sir," BC exclaimed, immediately bending to pick up the phone. Alexander's face twisted in irritation. He retrieved the phone from her outstretched hand. "Do you ever watch where you're going?" he snapped, brushing off his tailored suit. "I'm really sorry, sir. I didn't see you. You seem to have a knack for creating chaos wherever you go," he cut her off, his voice cold. Without waiting for her to respond, he turned and walked away, muttering under his breath. BC stood frozen for a moment, humiliation washing over her. But Tobi's situation was more important than her bruised pride. Shaking off the encounter, she hurried toward the daycare. At the daycare, Toby looked pale and lethargic, his usual energy gone. "Mummy," he whispered weakly as she scooped him into her arms. "My baby," BC murmured, kissing his hot forehead. She turned to Aisha. "Thank you for calling me." "You need to get him to a hospital," Aisha advised. "I will." "Thank you," BC said before rushing out. The journey to the hospital was tense. She held Toby close, whispering prayers under her breath as the Keke Marwa weaved through Lagos traffic. At the hospital, BC paced anxiously as a doctor examined Toby. After what felt like an eternity, the doctor emerged from the consultation room. "Madam, your son is stable now," he said, offering a reassuring smile. "It's a mild fever caused by an infection. We've administered some medication. Ensure he gets plenty of rest and fluids." "Thank you, doctor. Can I take him home?" "Yes, but keep an eye on him. If the fever persists, bring him back immediately." BC thanked the doctor profusely and settled the bill, grateful she could finally take her son home. By the time they returned to their apartment, it was already nightfall. She tucked Toby into bed, staying by his side until his breathing became calm and steady. The next morning, BC knew she needed time to care for Toby properly. She called the office early, explaining her situation to Mrs. Olowu. "Ma, please, I need a week off to take care of my son. He's still not well," BC said. "A whole week?" Mrs. Olowu sounded displeased. "Yes, Ma, I wouldn't ask if it wasn't urgent." After a long pause, Mrs. Olowu relented. "Fine. Take the week, but make sure this doesn't affect your work when you return." "Thank you, Ma," BC said, relief flooding her voice. Meanwhile, Alexander's frustration with his personal life was reaching its peak. After another morning spent searching for misplaced socks and enduring a subpar breakfast hastily prepared by himself, he slammed his fist onto the dining table. "Claire," he called, exasperated. She appeared moments later, a knowing look on her face. "Still no maid?" "No maid," he confirmed, rubbing his temples. "What's the point of being a millionaire if I can't even get a decent breakfast?" "Relax, Alex. We've had a few applications. You'll filter them today." Later that afternoon, Alexander sat in his office, going through paperwork when Claire walked in with a small stack of resumes. "Here are the top 3 candidates," she said, handing him the folder. He flipped through them absent-mindedly until one name caught his eye, BC Olamide. He frowned, staring at the name, as memories of the mop water incident and the hallway collision replayed in his mind. "Claire," he said slowly, holding up the resume. "This name seems familiar." Claire raised an eyebrow. "Really? Well, she's one of the shortlisted candidates. Should I schedule an interview?" Alexander leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "Yes," he said after a moment. "Schedule it. Let's see if she's as chaotic in an interview as she is in person." A small smirk played on his lips as he placed the resume on top of the pile. Alexander sat at the head of the long conference table, exuding authority and a subtle air of amusement. His office was filled with the golden hues of the afternoon sun streaming through the tall windows. The table in front of him held a neat pile of papers, including Bis's resume, which he glanced at for the 3rd time. Claire leaned over slightly, a bemused expression on her face. "You look like you're plotting something, Alex." "I might be," Alexander replied with a sly smile. "This should be interesting." Claire shook her head, laughing softly. "You know, you're supposed to be professional during interviews." "Don't worry, Claire," he said, leaning back in his chair. "You'll get the answers I need. Send her in." Moments later, BC was ushered into the room by a junior assistant. She looked nervous but composed, wearing a neatly pressed blouse and skirt. Her hair was pulled back into a bun, and she clutched her bag tightly. "Good afternoon, sir," she said, bowing slightly in respect. Alexander gestured for her to sit, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "Miss Olamide, is it?" "Yes, sir," BC replied, sitting down cautiously. "Well," Alexander said, picking up her resume, "you have an interesting work history. Cleaner, hairstylist, and now applying to be a maid. Quite the diverse background." BC hesitated, feeling the sting in his tone. "Yes, sir. I've done what I can to support myself and my son." "Your son?" Alexander raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "You didn't mention that here." I didn't think it was necessary, sir," she replied. Alexander tapped the resume with his pen. "It might be necessary. A child means responsibilities, distractions, perhaps even frequent absences. Why should I hire someone who might not always be available?" BC bristled slightly but maintained her composure. "Sir, I've been able to balance work and my son's needs effectively. I can assure you that I'm dedicated to my job." "Dedicated, you say?" Alexander leaned forward, his piercing eyes locking onto hers. Dedicated enough to avoid spilling mop water on your boss? Or crashing into him in the hallway? Beast's eyes widened in shock. Sir, Oh, don't act surprised, Alexander interrupted, a teasing edge in his voice. I knew it was you the moment I saw your name. Quite the string of accidents you've caused, Miss Olamide. BC flushed with embarrassment and frustration. Sir, I didn't mean for any of those things to happen. They were genuine accidents. Genuine, huh? Alexander leaned back in his chair, studying her. I'll admit, you have a knack for leaving a lasting impression. Claire, who had been silently observing, cleared her throat. Alex, maybe we should focus on the actual interview questions. Of course, Alexander said, waving a hand. He glanced down at her resume again. Why do you want this job? BC straightened her posture, eager to steer the conversation back to professionalism. I'm looking for a part-time opportunity to supplement my income. This job would allow me to provide better for my son and cover his school fees. Alexander raised a skeptical eyebrow. Part-time? What if I need you during hours you claim are off? Will you drop everything for this job, or will I come second to your other commitments? Sir, BC began, keeping her tone respectful but firm. I'm prepared to work hard and meet your expectations. If hired, I'll make sure my schedule aligns with your needs. He tilted his head, a calculating look on his face. And what makes you think you're qualified for this? Keeping a house in order isn't just about mopping floors and dusting shelves. I've managed a household before, sir, BC replied, her voice steady. I can handle cleaning, organizing, and even cooking if needed. I'm confident I can meet your standards. Cooking, you say? Alexander's smirk returned. What's your specialty? Burnt toast or undercooked rice? BC clenched her jaw, feeling her temper rise but forcing herself to remain calm. I make excellent jollof rice, sir. Perhaps you'd like to try it sometime. Claire stifled a laugh at BC's sharp yet polite reply, while Alexander's smirk deepened. I might take you up on that, he said, standing up suddenly. All right, Miss Olamide, you'll be hearing from us soon. Thank you, sir, BC said, standing as well and giving a slight bow before leaving the room. As the door closed behind her, Claire turned to Alexander with a knowing look. You're enjoying this far too much. She's got fire, Alexander admitted, pacing the room. And whether she knows it or not, I'm going to make sure she works for me. Call her tomorrow and tell her she's hired. Claire smirked. You sure this isn't about revenge? Oh, it is, Alexander said with a mischievous glint in his eye. But let's see how long it takes for her to figure that out. The Lagos skyline shimmered under the noon sun, and within the towering glass structure of Vanguard Oil, Nigeria, Alexander sat in his expansive office, his fingers drumming on his mahogany desk. A report lay open before him, a glowing testament to the incredible strides his company had made in the 10 months since he arrived in Nigeria. Profits were surging, operations were streamlined, and new contracts with major oil and gas companies were signed almost monthly. With success came envy. In a dimly lit lounge in a luxury hotel, 3 men sat around a table, their voices low but their intentions clear. This American boy has become a thorn in our side, said Chief Ugo, his beaded bracelet clinking against the table as he gestured. And in less than a year, added Mr. Femi, swirling his glass of whiskey. Do you know how much market share we've lost to his company? He's smart, muttered Alhaji Bala, a stout man with a perpetual scowl. Too smart for his own good. Chief Ugo leaned forward. We need to clip his wings before he spreads them further. A scandal, sabotage, whatever it takes to bring him down. Agreed, Femi said, smirking. Let's see how well he swims when the waters get rough. Meanwhile, at Alexander's sprawling home in Ikoyi, the day was quieter. BC stood in the kitchen, wearing her new maid's uniform, a simple but neat outfit that allowed her to move comfortably. She had spent 2 weeks acclimating to her new role, and though it was challenging, the stability it provided for her and Toby made it worthwhile. Alexander walked in, looking impeccable in his tailored suit, as usual. He paused, leaning against the doorframe and watching BC chop vegetables with swift precision. You're still here, he said, a playful lilt in his voice. BC looked up, confused. Sir? I thought you might have run off by now, he teased. It's been 2 weeks. Most people can't handle my pace, BC chuckled softly. I'm not most people, sir, Alexander smirked. Clearly, you've been impressive, I'll admit, which is why I'm about to make your life harder. She raised an eyebrow, setting the knife down. How so, sir? Move in, he said, his tone casual, as though he were asking her to fetch coffee. What? BC blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. You heard me, Alexander said, stepping further into the kitchen. Move in here. It'll make things easier for everyone. Less time spent commuting, fewer excuses for delays. You can go home on weekends to see your family, but during the week, I want you and your son here. BC stared at him, her mind racing. Sir, I don't think that's necessary. I can manage. I don't want you to manage, BC, Alexander replied firmly. I want efficiency. Toby can start school nearby, and my driver will handle his transportation. You'll have everything you need here. Think of it as a practical arrangement. But, sir, no buts, Alexander interrupted, his voice leaving no room for argument. I've already made arrangements for a second room to be furnished for Toby. This is happening. BC sighed, realizing she wasn't going to win this argument. All right, sir. I'll do it. Good. Alexander gave her a satisfied nod before turning to leave. And BC? Yes, sir? Relax. It's not a punishment. Later that evening, BC sat on her small bed watching Toby play with his toy cars. The idea of moving into Alexander's house filled her with both trepidation and relief. Mummy, are we going to live in a big house now? Toby asked, his wide eyes full of excitement. Yes, baby, BC said with a soft smile. But it's not forever, just for a little while, okay? Will there be a playground? BC chuckled, ruffling his hair. By the end of the week, BC and Toby had moved into Alexander's house. The driver carried their modest bags inside, while Alexander supervised, his sharp eyes missing nothing. Welcome, he said, gesturing toward the spacious living room. This is where you'll be working and living for now. Any questions? BC shook her head, overwhelmed by the grandeur of the house. Good, Alexander said, turning to Toby, who was clutching his mother's hand tightly. And you must be Toby. Toby nodded shyly. Don't worry, kid. You'll like it here, Alexander said, his tone unusually kind. Toby smiled faintly, and BC felt a flicker of gratitude. In his office later that night, Alexander leaned back in his chair, sipping a glass of scotch as he reviewed reports. He had no idea that powerful enemies were already setting their plans in motion, ready to challenge the empire he was building brick by brick. Unbeknownst to him, the battle for his success was about to get personal. The tension in Vanguard Oil, Nigeria was palpable. The once efficient office had descended into chaos over the past few weeks. Financial discrepancies had been flagged in company accounts, rumors of unethical practices had surfaced in the media, and several of their high-profile contracts were suddenly under scrutiny. It was as if someone had unleashed a coordinated attack to dismantle the empire Alexander had built. Alexander sat in the boardroom, his expression unreadable. Surrounding him were his key executives, all visibly shaken. Mr. Alexander, the audit team has found inconsistencies in our offshore accounts, Claire said, flipping through her tablet. We're looking at millions of dollars missing, and I don't have to tell you what this looks like to our partners. I know exactly what it looks like, Alexander replied coolly, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. But I also know it's not the truth. Someone's playing games. That's not all, another executive chimed in nervously. The press has gotten hold of the story. This morning, The Guardian published an article implying we've been bribing officials for drilling permits. Bribing officials? Alexander's voice hardened. That's laughable. Our operations have been above board from day one. Who leaked this nonsense? Whoever it is, Claire interjected. They've been thorough. Our investors are jittery, and our competitors are circling like vultures. If we don't act fast, this could sink us. Alexander leaned back, his sharp mind racing. This isn't just a random attack. It's orchestrated. Someone with access to our internal data is feeding these lies to the media and fabricating evidence. Claire hesitated before speaking. Sir, I hate to say it, but it could be someone within the company. I'll deal with that, Alexander said firmly. Right now, I need a list of every suspicious transaction flagged by the audit team. I want their timestamps, amounts, and the accounts involved. And Claire, contact our legal team. I'm not letting a single journalist print another word without consequences. Yes, sir. Behind the curtain, in a smoky private lounge, Chief Ugo and his cohorts reveled in their apparent success. I told you he wouldn't see it coming, Ugo said, raising a glass of champagne. That American boy thought he could waltz into Nigeria and take over. We've disrupted his operations, smeared his reputation, and then made him a liability to his investors, Femi added, grinning. By the time he recovers, if he recovers, his empire will be in ruins. Good riddance, Alhaji Bala muttered, puffing on a cigar. Alexander's team worked tirelessly through the night. By dawn, Claire entered his office with a USB drive in hand. This is everything you asked for, she said, placing it on his desk. We cross-referenced the flagged transactions and found a common thread. They all trace back to one account, registered to a shell company in the Cayman Islands. Alexander took the drive, his jaw tightening. Who owns the shell company? That's where it gets interesting, Claire said, her eyes glinting. It's linked to a local law firm. Guess who their biggest client is? Alexander's lips curved into a grim smile. Chief Ugo. Exactly, Claire replied. It's all there. The money, the fake reports, the leaks to the media. They've been orchestrating this from the start. Alexander stood, his mind already formulating a plan. They want a war? Fine. Let's give them one. The next morning, Alexander held a press conference. Cameras flashed as he stepped onto the stage, his commanding presence silencing the room. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice steady. I've called this conference to address the baseless allegations against Vanguard Oil Nigeria. Let me be clear. These accusations are false, and we have evidence to prove it. He gestured to the screen behind him, which lit up with charts and documents. Over the past few weeks, our company has been the target of a malicious campaign orchestrated by individuals who feel threatened by our success. We've identified these perpetrators and are taking legal action against them. The room buzzed with murmurs as reporters scrambled to process the bombshell. Alexander continued, To our investors, partners, and employees, this is not the end of Vanguard Oil Nigeria. This is a new beginning. We will not be intimidated, and we will not back down. Later that evening, Alexander paid a surprise visit to Chief Ugo's residence. He walked into the grand living room unannounced, his bodyguards flanking him. Alex, Ugo said, feigning surprise. What brings you here? Alexander smiled coldly. Cut the act, Chief. I know what you've been up to. I have no idea what you're talking about, Ugo replied smoothly. Save it, Alexander snapped, throwing a folder onto the table. That's everything. Your shell company, your transactions, your leaks to the media. You thought you could take me down, but you underestimated me. Ugo's expression darkened. You have no proof. Oh, I have plenty, Alexander said, his voice low and menacing. And I've already handed it over to the authorities. If you're smart, you'll start preparing your defense. This is checkmate, Chief. Over the next few weeks, the tide turned in Alexander's favor. The press exposed Chief Ugo's schemes, and the legal system began to take action. Investors regained confidence in Vanguard Oil Nigeria, and Alexander's reputation as a resilient and resourceful leader was cemented. One evening, as he sat in his study, Claire walked in with a glass of scotch. You did it, she said, handing him the drink. Alexander smiled, raising the glass in a mock toast, to survival and a little revenge. Claire laughed. You know, Alex, you're not just building an empire, you're making history. And history, Alexander replied, his eyes gleaming, is written by the victors. BC woke up to the sound of Tobis' giggles as he played with his toy cars in the corner of the spacious guest room they shared. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting a warm glow on the polished wooden floor. She stretched, glancing at the clock. 6:45 a.m. Her new routine in Alexander's home was a whirlwind. From managing the seemingly endless tasks he assigned to ensuring Tobis' needs were met, her days were full. Yet there was an undercurrent in their interactions, a tension she couldn't quite place. Mommy, are we going to see Mr. Alex today? Toby asked, his eyes sparkling with innocence. BC smiled, ruffling his hair. Mr. Alex is your boss now, too, Let's just get ready for the day, my little man. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the sleek, modern kitchen as BC prepared breakfast. Alexander appeared, already dressed in a crisp navy suit, his tie impeccably knotted. His presence immediately filled the room, and BC felt her breath hitch for a moment. Good morning, BC, he said, his tone brisk. Good morning, sir, she replied, setting his coffee down on the marble countertop. Black coffee, 2 sugars? You've memorized it. Impressive. Well, you demand it every morning at exactly 7:15 a.m. It's hard to miss, she said, a hint of sarcasm slipping through. He raised an eyebrow, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Careful, Miss Olamide. That tone might get you in trouble. Before she could respond, Toby ran into the kitchen, his tiny arms wrapping around Beesis' legs. Good morning, Mr. Alex. Alexander looked down at the boy, his stern expression softening. Morning, champ. Ready for school? Yes, sir, Toby replied enthusiastically. BC knelt to adjust Toby's shirt, avoiding Alexander's gaze. Hez all set. Your driver will drop him off, right? Of course, Alexander said, taking a sip of his coffee. I'd never let my future CEO be late. BC rolled her eyes but smiled despite herself. By mid-morning, BC was juggling multiple tasks. Alexander had a way of issuing orders that kept her on her toes. BC, I need the dining table cleared. I'm hosting a quick lunch meeting at noon. Yes, sir. And can you make sure my office windows are spotless? I hate distractions during meetings. Noted. Oh, and BC, yes, Mr. Alex? Don't forget to pick up the dry cleaning. The receipt's on the hall table. She exhaled sharply. Anything else, Your Majesty? He smirked at her sarcasm. Not right now, but I'll let you know. BC muttered under her breath as she walked away. This man is going to drive me crazy. That evening, as BC finished cleaning the living room, she found Alexander seated on the couch, his laptop open, but his focus elsewhere. She paused, watching him. His features were sharp and defined, but there was a softness in his eyes she hadn't noticed before. Is something wrong, Mr. Alex? She asked, breaking the silence. He looked up, startled. No, just thinking. About? He hesitated before responding. This house used to feel empty. I guess it doesn't anymore. BC blinked, caught off guard by his honesty. Well, it's full of commands now. I barely have time to sit. He chuckled, the sound deep and genuine. You're good at what you do, BC. Maybe too good. That's why I keep giving you more to do. She shook her head, laughing softly. You're impossible, you know that? So I've been told. For a moment their eyes met and something unspoken passed between them. But before either could acknowledge it, Toba's voice rang out from the hallway. Mommy, can you read me a story? BC turned away, her cheeks warming. Coming, baby. Alexander watched her leave, a small smile playing on his lips. As BC tucked Toby into bed, she couldn't shake the strange feeling in her chest. She had come to this house out of necessity, but something about being here felt different. Meanwhile, Alexander stood by the large window in his study, staring out at the city lights. His life had always been about control over his company, his reputation, his future. But BC's presence was unsettling that control in ways he couldn't explain. Strange, he muttered to himself. She's just a maid. Why does it feel like she's more than that? Neither of them realized how deeply their lives were becoming intertwined, bound by unspoken affection that grew with every passing day. The hall was abuzz with activity as staff and decorators moved around, transforming the space for Alexander's much-anticipated end-of-year party. It was the highlight of the company's calendar, a lavish affair where successes were celebrated and employees mingled freely with their enigmatic boss. Alexander sat in his office, reviewing the guest list one final time. His phone buzzed on the desk. Mr. Wilson, his assistant Margaret called over the intercom. The caterers are asking for your approval on the menu. I'll be right there, he replied curtly. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes drifting to the framed photo of his family on the edge of his desk. It was an old picture. His father, with his broad smile and unmistakable charisma, stood in the center. Beside him, Alexander and his younger brother were laughing, carefree and young. The sound of knocking interrupted his thoughts. Come in, he called. BC stepped in, looking a little unsure. Mr. Alex, you wanted to see me? Yes, he said, setting the photo down. I'd like you to come to the party tonight. Her eyes widened. Me? Sir, You're not just anything, BC. You've been here through everything this year. I want you there. Bring Toby, too. The employees' families are invited. She hesitated. Are you sure? It's not exactly my scene. He gave her a rare smile. You'll fit in just fine. It's important to me, BC. Her heart skipped at the sincerity in his tone. Okay, thank you. By late afternoon, Alexander was making his final preparations when his phone rang. Hello? Alexander, a voice he hadn't heard in months, said, cracking with urgency. It was his younger brother, Matthew. Matt? What's going on? It's Dad, Matthew said, his voice trembling. He's not doing well. The doctors say you need to come home, soon. Alexander's grip on the phone tightened. His father had always been the pillar of their family, larger than life. The thought of him being weak, sick, was almost unimaginable. How bad is it? Bad enough, Matthew said. You'll see when you get here. Alexander's chest tightened. It'll be on the next flight. Alexander ended the call and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. His mind raced. There was so much to do, so much to leave behind. His company was thriving, but it was also at a critical stage. He couldn't just leave without ensuring it was in capable hands. Margaret knocked and entered without waiting. Mr. Wilson, the decorations are complete and the sound checks are done. Everything's on schedule. Good, he said absently. She frowned. Sir, is everything okay? He looked at her, his usual composed expression faltering. Margaret, I need to leave Nigeria for a while. Family emergency. Her eyebrows shot up. For how long? I don't know yet. You'll need someone to handle things here while I'm gone. Margaret nodded, already running through options in her mind. There are several capable hands, but if I may suggest, Mr. Adedeji has been particularly outstanding in the finance department. You'll think about it, Alexander said. Meanwhile, BC stood in her small guest room trying on the one formal dress she owned. Toby sat on the bed, watching her with wide eyes. Mommy, you look like a princess, he declared. She laughed. A princess? This dress is old, Toby. It's beautiful, he insisted. There was a knock at the door. When BC opened it, she found Alexander standing there, dressed in a tailored tuxedo. Wow, he said, his eyes scanning her. You look perfect. Her cheeks burned. Thank you. You don't look so bad yourself. He smiled, but quickly grew serious. You'll need to leave right after the party. My father's ill, and I have to go back home. I wanted you to know. I'm sorry to hear that, she said softly. He nodded, his jaw tight. It's a lot to process, but tonight is for the company. Let's make it count. The event was grand, with chandeliers casting a warm glow over the hall and tables adorned with gold accents. Employees mingled, their laughter and chatter filling the space. Alexander gave his customary speech, thanking everyone for their hard work and loyalty. When he spotted BC in the crowd, her soft smile calmed the storm in his mind. As the evening wound down, he pulled her aside. BC, I'll need you to keep things running smoothly at the house while I'm gone. Can I count on you? Of course, she said. And thank you for being here tonight. It means more than you know. She looked up at him, her heart skipping at the vulnerability in his voice. You don't have to thank me. Just take care of your father. For the first time in years, Alexander felt something he couldn't quite name, something warm and grounding. He didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, he was grateful for BC's quiet strength by his side. Alexander stood by the hospital window, gazing out at the bustling New York skyline. The city that once felt like home now felt cold and distant. His father's condition had stabilized, much to everyone's relief, but there was a heaviness in Alexander's chest that wouldn't lift. Alex, his father's weak voice, called from the bed. He turned quickly, pulling a chair close to the bedside. Yes, Dad? His father's piercing blue eyes, though tired, were as sharp as ever. You've been restless since you got here. What's on your mind? Alexander hesitated. He had always shared everything with his father, but this felt different. It's nothing, Dad. Just the company and some personal matters. His father chuckled softly, though it turned into a brief cough. Don't lie to me, son. I know that look. There's a woman, isn't there? Alexander froze. How do you? Because I've been where you are, his father interrupted. When I met your mother, I couldn't sleep, couldn't think straight until I told her how I felt. You've been pacing this room like a caged animal for days. Tell me about her. A small smile tugged at Alexander's lips. Her name is BC. She's smart, hardworking, and kind. She has a son, Toby, an incredible little boy. They're both everything. His father's smile widened. And you love her. Alexander exhaled deeply. Yes, I do. Then what are you doing here? His father asked, his tone suddenly stern. Go to her. Life is too short to waste time. The next morning, Alexander packed his bags with an urgency he hadn't felt in years. As he boarded the flight back to Nigeria, his heart raced with anticipation and nervousness. What if she didn't feel the same? What if she had moved on? But deep down, he knew he had to try. BC sat on the couch in her small home, watching Toby play with his toy cars. It had been weeks since Alexander left, and though she tried to focus on her work and her son, her thoughts often drifted to him. She shook her head, chastising herself. Stop it, BC. He's your boss, not your. Mummy, who's that? Toby asked suddenly, pointing to the window. She turned, and her heart stopped. There, standing by the gate in a crisp suit, was Alexander. BC hurried to the door, her hands trembling as she unlocked it. "Mr. Alex?" "BC," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "I hope I'm not intruding." "No, not at all. Please, come in." He stepped inside, his tall frame almost filling the small living room. Toby ran up to him, grinning. "Uncle Alex." Alexander crouched down, ruffling the boy's hair. "Hey, champ. How are you?" "I'm fine. Did you bring me chocolate?" Alexander laughed. "Not this time, but I owe you one." BC watched the exchange, her heart swelling. She cleared her throat. "What brings you here, sir? Is everything okay?" He stood, his expression turning serious. "I came back for you, BC, for you and Toby." Her eyes widened. "I don't understand." He took a step closer, his gaze intense. "When I left, I thought I could focus on my father, on my life in the States. But every day I missed you. I missed Toby. I realized that my house felt empty without your laughter, your presence." "Mr. Alex, call me Alex," he said firmly. "No more formalities. I love you, BC. I love everything about you. Your strength, your kindness, the way you care for Toby. I want us to be a family." Tears welled up in her eyes. "Alex, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll be with me," he urged. "Say you'll give us a chance." BC took a deep breath, her heart pounding. "Alex, I've always respected you, admired you. But love, it's not something I thought was possible for me anymore, especially not with someone like you." "Someone like me?" he asked, tilting his head. "Someone powerful, wealthy, with the world at their feet. I'm just a single mother trying to make ends meet." Alexander reached for her hands, his touch warm and reassuring. "BC, none of that matters. What matters is how I feel about you, and how you feel about me. Do you feel anything for me?" She nodded slowly, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Yes, I do." He smiled, pulling her into a gentle embrace. "Then that's all that matters." Toby tugged at Alexander's sleeve. "Does this mean you'll be my daddy now?" Alexander crouched down again, his voice filled with emotion. "If your mummy will let me, I'd be honored to be your daddy." Toby grinned. "Yay!" Months later, BC and Alexander stood hand in hand at a small, intimate wedding ceremony. Friends, family, and colleagues gathered to celebrate their union. As they exchanged vows, BC looked into Alexander's eyes, her heart overflowing with gratitude and love. After the wedding, they moved to America, where Alexander's father, now recovered, welcomed them with open arms. Toby started school, thriving in his new environment while BC adjusted to her new life as Alexander's wife. Back in Nigeria, Alexander's company flourished under the capable leadership of the team he had left behind, proof of the solid foundation he had built. In the quiet moments, as they sat together in their new home, Alexander would often whisper, "Thank you for giving me a reason to believe in love again." And BC, smiling, would always reply, "Thank you for making me feel like I was always enough." Their journey had been unexpected, but it was proof that love could bloom even in the most unlikely circumstances. Together, they built a life filled with love, laughter, and unshakable trust, a true happily ever after.